There we go. Okay. My name is Howard Eber, and I am an alcoholic. Welcome to the Big Book Comes Alive Step Study Workshop. This is week number 28 of this cycle. We are in We Agnostics. We've started at the forwards and the prefaces and so on, and we've diagnosed the condition in the doctor's opinion that we have this threefold malady: a spiritual malady, which means we are restless and irritable and discontented. And for me, that was putting it mildly. I was hypersensitive. I was overly critical. I was not a pleasant person to be around. And I realized that the only way I could get any relief from me was to take that first drink or that first drug. And even though I know what happens most of the time, eventually I convince myself that it won't happen this time. And I give in to that mental component, which is the obsession. And the obsession is that I don't have a physical allergy, which is triggered once I take that out first drink or that first drug. I have an almost allergic type reaction, which is an abnormal reaction to that substance. Most people have a few lines, a few drinks, a few hits, whatever's going around, and you offer them one more, and no, thank you. I'm going to get sick if I do too much more, or I got to drive, so I got to take it easy. Or they start saying some very strange expressions like, I'm right where I want to be. I've had enough. To which I say, you've got to drink through that, because the promised land is just about 4 or 5 drinks on the other side of that idea. And that's my reaction to the ingestion of these chemicals, is to want more and more and more. That is my abnormal reaction. And if I have this threefold malady, I can't fix myself. A sick mind cannot heal a sick mind. I am in need of a power greater than myself to do for me what I couldn't do for myself. The same way the alcohol and drugs did for me what I could never do, what I wanted to do, the person I wanted to be or I thought I wanted to be. The chemicals that allowed me to do that, those chemicals had a power much greater than I, but it was a destructive power. And we're in need of a providential, beneficial power that can get between us and that first drink, because we are without defense against that first drink, which we learned by reading. There is a solution. We went through Bill's story and saw how an alcoholic recovers. We talked about the solution in There Is a Solution. We talked about what happens to people who don't find that solution in More About Alcoholism. And now we're approaching something a little bit different. I think before he gets into the actual program in the next chapter, Bill must be thinking, there's bound to be some people who just don't want it, can't, they gag on this God notion. And it's all because of old ideas and emotions and attitudes that are brought in here, that baggage we carry. The baggage that Bill Wilson carried when Ebbie was talking to him about this spiritual program. And Ebbie's talking about God and he's talking about spirituality. And Bill is hearing religion, because that's what he equates in his mind. Religion and God are one and the same. And I thought the same way. That's one of my old ideas that had to be cast aside, because God does not equal religion. Religion is a set of practices. You want to be in a certain club? You want to worship our imaginary best friend? Well, these are the things you have to do. Pray like this, dress like this, eat like this. That's religion. Very harsh terms, at least I feel. Spirituality is none of that. Spirituality is a set of disciplines. I've got to have a discipline for God and for prayer and meditation, and I define those terms. Nobody else tells me that. Nobody in this room will ever tell you this is what you have to believe, this is what you have to, how you have to pray, and so on. It is so liberating to know that we can come to those conclusions ourselves. And so he sat down and he wrote a chapter addressed to those of us who have difficulty with that, and he calls it We Agnostics. And as I said when we started this chapter, I believe that is addressed to every one of us. Everyone in this room, I believe, is an agnostic, whether we think so or not. And if you doubt your agnosticism, what is the current area of your life that is most unmanageable now? What is the area of your life that you think you must somehow get involved in and exert some self will on? Maybe it's getting a job. Maybe it's somebody who you love has a health problem. Any number of things that we feel we have to somehow jump in and do a little bit more and pray a little bit more for that person and so on, and pray for an end. And that's not what this is about. We pray for strength, courage, and acceptance. We don't pray for conclusions. And where we are today, after all of that Mishigas, we're in We Agnostics on page 50, I believe. We left off on page 50 last week. Let's just a couple of things to point out. On page 48 at the top, we started to identify some of the things that block us from spiritual growth. And at the top of the page, the first two lines contain three of those things: obstinacy, sensitiveness, and unreasoning prejudice. Those are some of the things that block us from spiritual growth. We're about to run into a few more on the next few pages, but we're trying to take a look at some of the things that have gotten in our way. And one of the things that we had to do was we had to have a starting point to pursue this power, to try and set aside the things we think we know. We need a starting point, and that starting point has to be recognition that there is that power. And unless we have that assumption, we can proceed no further. We have to have that assumption to start with. And based on that assumption, we can make an approach to that power, and we can start a relationship with that power, and we could rely on that power to do for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. So we began that process, if you remember, a week or two ago. I suggested you sit down with a pad and a pen and write out a list of traits, a list of qualities that you would like your higher power to have. Whatever that is: all-knowing, all-seeing, forgiving. If you believe your higher power, if you believe God is punishing, put that down. Whatever you think God is. God has a sense of humor. God is, without a doubt, a Miles Davis fan. No other way to explain Miles. But whatever you think God is, please put that down on a piece of paper. And now you have your starting point. And based upon that list, however inadequate it is, you can begin your approach. And Bill has pointed out that when you see that word God in this book, we're referring to your conception. We need a point of identification. We need a way to recognize the things we're talking about. So when this book mentions God, it's not the Roman Catholic, the Jewish, the Buddhist God. It's none of those things unless you believe that's your higher power. When we use the G word, it's your notion of that. And Bill even gives us some substitutes, some synonyms, some alternate ways of saying God. And we're going to come across a few more of them today. So if you hear those words, try to hear that word G word. You can try some of these other words. Maybe that'll fit a little bit better. And where was the last thing I wanted to draw your attention to? Nope, we have our starting point. We're on page 50. And Bill has mentioned in the second paragraph is where I want to start. And the first three lines of this paragraph, beginning with in our personal stories, I'm going to suggest that you highlight those first three lines. Throughout the book, Bill gives us what I perceive to be advice on how to tell our story. When we get up in front of a room and we're asked to share our experience, strength, and hope, what do? It's not to talk about how we were drinking and drugging. It's not to tell a war story along those lines. On telling your story, Bill says, in our personal stories, you will find a wide variation in the way, and please underline this, each teller approaches and conceives of the power which is greater than himself. Next to that, I'm going to suggest you write also, see page 29, 2. And if you just hold this page where it is, hold 50 where it is, but bounce over to page 29 for a moment, indulge me, for some real specific information on how to tell your story when you're asked to get up there and share your experience, strength, and hope. The second paragraph, each individual in the personal stories describes in his own language, from his own point of view, the way he established his relationship with God. This will give you a clear-cut idea of what has actually happened in their lives. So we are telling how we conceived of and approached that power, how we came to believe, how we went from the journey of belief across the bridge of reason to the solid shore of faith, which may seem foreign because we haven't gotten to that page yet, but we will, hopefully today. But the point is, we go from a hope, which is belief, and based on that hope, we make a decision to pursue a plan of action that produces results. And the results are, we no longer believe, we know, we have faith. But the stories that we tell are how we got to that point through the steps. That's what we're supposed to be doing when we get up in front of the room, is telling you of my spiritual journey. From that agnosticism, from that doubt, to having some hope and crossing that bridge of reason and that landing on that solid shore of faith, the first part of the 12th step. So let's get back to page 50. After it, which is the power which is greater than himself, whether we agree with the particular approach or conception seems to make little difference. Experience, and you may want to underline that word, experience has taught us that these are matters which for our purpose we need not be worried. And please highlight this sentence. They are questions for each individual to settle for himself. It doesn't matter how you got there. What is important is that you got there. So opposite, if you have the study version, yeah, we might have gotten a little past that last week, but I'm going to.
Yeah, we're going to recap.
Yeah, we're going to recap. Someone is asking about where we started. We're covering some of the areas we started last week. We have a lot of new faces here, so I want to just recap a little bit. If you have the study version of the study guide, which has a blank page every other page, and if you'd like information on how to obtain a copy of this, just ask us and we'll show you. It has a blank page every other page for note taking, and we really suggest you pick that up. But if you have that, opposite what we just read, I'm going to suggest you write a question. The question is, what is my conception of a power greater than myself? What is that? Now, we've already made that list, so that should be an easy question to answer. But we have to have that as a starting point. So let's continue. On one proposition, however, these men and women are strikingly agreed. We're talking about the first 100. The very first page of this book says this is based on how 100 men and women have recovered from a hopeless state of mind and body. And it is the purpose of this book to tell you precisely, show you, not tell you, show you precisely how they have recovered. So every one of them, and please highlight the rest of this next two sentences in pink. We use pink for prayers and promises, and I'm sure Anita or Bina will put that in the chat, all of the silly color codes we use for highlighting. Indulge me. We use the color codes so that if you're looking for things like musts in this book, thumb through it and look for the green highlighter. You'll get all of the musts. And right now we've counted about 141 of them. So don't say there are no musts in the big book. If you want to see the references to recovered, another word we're told not to use, thumb through the book and you'll find it highlighted in orange. Another point we try and make is that it's our responsibility to approach the newcomer, not to take an attitude of being available, but to approach. And we highlight those examples in blue. And as I said before, prayers and promises are in pink. So if you're looking for those, just thumb through the book and stop at the pink highlight. And here's one of them. Here's a promise. Every one of them, of those 100, has gained access to and believes in a power greater than himself. This power has in each case accomplished the miraculous, the humanly impossible. Please underline humanly impossible. As the celebrated American statesman put it, Let's look at the record. And the celebrated American statesman we're talking about is the governor at that time of New York, Alfred Smith, who also ran for president. And I'm pretty sure Bill Wilson supported him, but that's neither here nor there. But that was one of his expressions. Let's look at the record. Here are thousands of men and women. In my book, Above Thousands, I wrote millions, because we're not thousands anymore. We are millions of men and women, worldly indeed. They flatly declare that since they have, and I'm going to ask that you highlight the rest of this page in pink. And this is the main reason I'm reviewing what we covered last week, is this section here, because this encapsulates so much of what we already talked about for the previous 50 pages. They declare flatly that they have come to believe in a power greater than themselves. Let's underline that, and above it write step 2, belief. To take a certain attitude, please underline certain attitude, and above that write step 3, decision. Because that's what a certain attitude is. It's a decision toward that power, and to, please underline, do certain simple things. And above that write steps 4 through 9, take action. So what this says is those 100, they've come to believe in that power greater than themselves. They took an attitude towards it. They made a decision to pursue that power by implementing a plan of action to do certain simple things. They've done that, and this says there has been a revolutionary change. Please underline revolutionary change in their way of living and thinking. That revolutionary change, you can encapsulate as 10, 11, and 12, but most importantly, it's the first part of the 12th step, a spiritual awakening, which is a change in personality, a revolutionary change in their way of living and thinking. In the face of collapse and despair, in the face of their total failure of their human resources, please underline human resources, that is self-will. In the face of the failure of our self-will, we found a new power. Let's underline that. Peace, let's underline that. Happiness, let's underline that. And a sense of direction, let's underline that. That's the result. The revolutionary change, that's what it is. It's a new sense of power, peace, happiness, and a sense of direction that flows into them. This happened soon after. You may want to circle that word, after. They wholeheartedly, and one of the members of the group a while back suggested that wholeheartedly sounds like a must. So he highlighted it in green. I'm not so sure yet, but if you feel it's a must, highlight it in green. But there's coming up another one right here. As soon as they wholeheartedly meant a few simple requirements, and requirements is a must. It's a $20 way of saying must. If I'm required to do something, I must do it. So this happened soon after they wholeheartedly met a few simple requirements. They took action. Once confused and baffled by the seeming futility means uselessness, by the seeming uselessness of existence, they showed the underlying reasons why they were making heavy going of life. Please highlight heavy going of life, and above it, I've written self-will. Please underline these next words, leaving aside the drink question. Bill is kind of drawing a line here. We're on page 51, and we're turning away from alcohol. We're not concerned about alcohol anymore. We're leaving aside that drink question. We're not talking about what life was like with alcohol. We're now talking about life without alcohol, without a program. They tell why living was so unsatisfactory. They show, please underline that word, show, how the change came over them, how that personality change came over them. When many hundreds of people, and again, to me, it's millions of people are able to say, and please highlight the rest of this paragraph, the consciousness of the presence of God is today the most important fact of their lives, they present a powerful reason why one should have faith. Important fact. This is the basis of the AA program, incidentally. This presence of God is the most important fact of our lives. Where are we? This world of ours has made more material progress in the last century than all the millenniums that went before. And I'm going to suggest that we've made more progress in the last decade. Forget about the last century. Think about the last 10 or 20 years. Think about this, the cell phone. This computer, forget about cell phone. It is a computer. It's not a cell phone anymore. It functions as a phone, but it's a cell phone. And just to put it in perspective, how this thing came about, real side note, we're going to go off on a tangent here. Terry, I'm going to borrow that from you. In 1998, a company called RIM introduced their first, what they call a pocket link, a mega mail device, an email device, this handheld email device, no phone, just for communication via email. That's in 1998. So from 1998 to today, look what's happened. In 1999, 1 year later, that company, RIM, first of all, they changed their name to BlackBerry. And they introduced the first BlackBerry cell phone. On January 19th, 1999 is when that first phone made its appearance. Apple introduced their iPhone in June of 2007, 8 years after BlackBerry. So between 2007 and today, the iPhone has come to this point, which, as far as I'm concerned, I love Apple and I will always stay with Apple, but they're getting blown away by some of the advances to some of the other companies, but they still make a hell of a product. But the point is that during these past few decades, we have come so far in that one area. Continuing, they've made more material progress in the last century, last decades, than in all the millenniums which went before. Almost everyone knows the reason. Students of ancient history tell us that the intellect of men, please underline or circle and highlight the word intellect. You see, intellect, I thought, meant smart, intelligence. If you looked it up in the dictionary, intellect is defined as the capacity to learn. That's what intelligence is, the capacity to learn. Do we have an open mind or a closed mind? And he's pointing out here that the intellect of men hundreds of years ago was the same as today. Yet it took a long time to come up with, what did they come up with? Well, fire, the wheel, gunpowder, the printing press. It took hundreds of years to do that. To go from in a cave to in a house and having printing press and having fire and so on, hundreds of years. If the capacity to learn was the same, what held them back? What held back their development? Well, we're about to see. In ancient times, material progress was painfully slow. Absolutely. As I said, hundreds of years to come up with fire, gunpowder, the wheel, the printing press. The spirit of modern scientific inquiry, research, and invention was almost unknown. In the realm of the material, men's minds were fettered by, please highlight the rest of this sentence. Let's underline superstition. Let's underline tradition. Let's underline fixed ideas. And let's number them. Superstition is number 4. Tradition is number 5. And fixed ideas is number 6. For those of you who are just starting today, that's why I mentioned what was on the top of the page. 48, the first three things. On the top of page 48, we had things that block us from progress, from spiritual progress: obstinacy, sensitiveness, unreasoning prejudice. We now have three more things: superstition, tradition, and fixed ideas. Superstition, don't we? I think we all know what that is. Tradition is just a set of practices, the way of doing things. I'll give you an example. My last job before I retired, I was hired as a sales manager at a car dealership, and there was another sales manager there. So we were equals. We were equals. He wasn't any further, had more authority than I did. We compensated the same and so on. And in the car business, when it snows and you have a blizzard, you have to take some action, drastic action, to move the cars, plow the lot, clean the cars, then do it all over again. And when we had our first blizzard, when I went to work there, he immediately put into effect the plan that he has been using before. And I watched it and I thought, gee, that's not the best way to do this. And I suggested to him, I said, can I make a suggestion here? I think I have an alternate way of doing that I think will save some time and effort. And he just turned to me and said, look, this is the way we do things here. Now, I could have very easily have said, great, you take half the sales force and do it that way, and I'll take the other half and do it my way. But I didn't. I didn't want to die on that hill. But the point is, he was waving that flag of fixed ideas and traditions, that this is the way we did it, because he never even asked, what do you have in mind? Never did. To the day I left that company, he never did. The point being, it got in the way of what I believe to be progress. But it's a tradition. It's a way of doing things. It's a set of practices. Some of the contemporaries of Columbus thought a round earth preposterous. We're going to come back to good old Chris in a moment. Others came near putting Galileo to death for his astronomical heresies. Please underline Galileo. Please underline astronomical heresies. Andy, if you wouldn't mind giving me 4-7. Galileo. Galileo came from Tuscany, an area in central Italy, was a physicist, a mathematician, a philosopher, and an astronomer. And it was his interest in astronomy that got him in trouble. You see, he was a believer in Copernicanism, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Copernicanism. That was a theory that stated that the universe was heliocentric. Helio meaning the sun, centric meaning of the universe, the center of the universe. Copernicus believed that the sun was the center of the universe and all of the planets, including Earth, circled around it. Now, this was merely a hypothesis because Copernicus, who formulated that theory, didn't have a telescope. He was only able to observe the sun and the stars with his naked eye. This telescope wasn't invented till 55 years after he died. And he died 21 years before Galileo was invented. But Galileo believed in those practices. He believed that the universe revolved around the sun. And he had, at the time, a telescope, because the first telescope was invented in 1608 by a gentleman in the Netherlands. His name was Hans Lippershey, and I know I'm not pronouncing that right. But the first telescope could only magnify by a factor of 3 times. Galileo, who was 44 when that was discovered, then spent the next year working on his version of that invention, and he succeeded. He advanced it to the point where the ability to magnify was up to 30. So he was able to watch the heavens, watch these planets, and have a little bit more information than Copernicus did. So he had the ability to scientifically observe the sky, and he became convinced that Copernicanism was correct. The problem was the Roman Catholic Church. You see, the church scripture stated otherwise. They spoke of geocentrism, meaning the earth was the center of the universe, that the universe revolved around earth. The reason is because God created man first. So earth was the first planet, everything else revolved around it. Now, this was during the Roman Inquisition, when it was very dangerous. It could be deadly to take a position against the church or that was disagreeing with church policies. So Galileo was a great example of someone possessing great intelligence, the capacity to learn, who came in conflict with the fixed ideas and prejudices of the Catholic Church. Now, in an effort to set the record straight, the story goes that Galileo was pushing his belief, and the Catholic Church asked him to recount. And make a long story short, he eventually did recant. But the problem actually turned out to be Galileo's ego, because the church at the time was a lot more open-minded than you think. The church was willing to accept Copernicanism as a hypothesis, meaning a theory without adequate evidence to prove it one way or the other. They were open-minded enough to acknowledge that that's a hypothesis. They weren't open to the new idea of just accepting it, but they didn't reject it either. And Galileo demanded that they accept it. So the problem with Galileo was more his ego and his intelligence. So that's the story we're talking about here when it comes to Galileo, that he was almost put to death for his new beliefs that the universe circled around the sun. Now, Chris Columbus is a whole different story. I think, and I learned this from Joe and Charlie, that Chris Columbus was probably an alcoholic. Think about it. He didn't know where he was going when he left on his first visit. He didn't know where he was when he got here. And he didn't know where he was when he got back. And he got a woman to finance the whole enterprise a second time. Now, let's take a look at Chris Columbus. Andy, if you'll give me the Eastern Hemisphere, I think that's 4.9. Follow me. Hang on. There's a point in pursuing Chris Columbus here. We're beating it to death, but there's a point in this. This is what the world was in those days. It was the Eastern Hemisphere. As we recall it now, we call it the Eastern Hemisphere because we know that there's another part on the other side of this page, but they did not. And when they wanted to trade for gold, spices, and silk in the East Indies, they had to go from Spain and Portugal over here, which is where Columbus was, around through the Atlantic Ocean, under Africa, around the Cape, which was pretty dangerous, and around Australia, up through the Pacific Ocean into China. Or they could take a land route by taking it across the Mediterranean Sea and then trudging by land over what was Iran, became Iran, and Turkey, and India, and Pakistan to China. Or they could go through what became the Suez Canal, which wasn't there at the time, and come up and go across India. Either way, to get to there, to get to the east, that's where they wanted to go, to the east. They had to put a lot of time and effort into sailing there or trudging across the land. Christopher Columbus had a theory that this wasn't what the universe looked like, what the world looked like, that the world was round, that he can get to the east by sailing west. Now tell me that isn't alcoholic logic. Someone tells you I could go east by going west. You tell them to calm down. Let me get you a cup of chamomile tea. Let's relax, take some deep breaths. We'll talk about it later. But that was his belief. And he managed to convince somebody, a queen, Queen Isabella, to put up the money so he can sail west, sail this way, that arrow at the top, this way, and not fall off the edge of the earth. Now, when Columbus set out, Andy, I think you could take that down. We don't need that anymore. When Columbus set out, he only had a belief. He had a belief that he could go he can go east by sailing west. I sometimes forget that. I can reverse it. So he had a willingness, okay? And the chances are that even though he had that belief, when he set sail on that first voyage across the ocean, that everyone was saying, you'll fall off the edge, Chris, because the earth is flat, not round. When he set out on that first voyage, it's more than likely that he took a sailor and put him on the bow of the front ship and gave him one of these, gave him a little lantern, and he said, tonight when it gets dark, I want you to look out in front of this ship, and if you see the edge of this thing, I want you to wave it and start screaming like crazy so we could turn this son of a bitch around and not fall off the edge. So he had a belief, but he still covered his bets. When he came back, he didn't need that lantern. He didn't need that sailor because he didn't go on belief. When he was coming back, he was going on knowledge. He was going on experience. He was going on faith. So the journey of Chris Columbus there's a lesson in Chris Columbus that we're going to talk about now. It's that 5-part formula for change. Andy, let's put that up and start talking about it. If you've got the study version, you may want to write this in a blank page opposite where we are. This is a flip chart. The 5. Ready, Andy? There's a 5-part formula for change. The first thing we need, the requirement, is we have to be willing. In order to change, one must be willing. Now, what makes us willing? Well, circumstances make us willing. Columbus wanted to find that shortcut to the East Indies, and that made him willing. So based on that willingness, what happens? Number 2, he believes that in order to change, that he can do so. He's willing, but he's also believing that it can be done. Those can be two things. He's willing, but he doesn't know how to do it. He believes he has a way to do it. So part 2 of the formula is belief. So if you're writing this in the blank page, we got number 1, willingness. Number 2, belief. Number 3, we make a decision. And in order to change, one must decide to do so. In Columbus's case, he decided to prove his beliefs by putting into action a plan. Number 4, take action. In order to change, you have to act on your decision. Otherwise, you're a frog on a log. You're just sitting there and not going anywhere. So he had to take action, which in our case would be steps 4 through 11. So we have to be willing, we have to believe, step 2, we have to make a decision, step 3, we have to then take action, 4 through 11. And then what happens? We get results. Our actions have an effect. We change. Columbus put his beliefs to the test and he got results. The world wasn't flat. He didn't sail off the edge of the earth. He didn't make it to the East Indies either, but he at least discovered that the earth was round. You can take that down, Andy. That's the 5-part formula for change that's mentioned, that's hinted at in Columbus. and is in the story of Columbus, and is referred to in the next few pages a few times. But let's see if we can find it. So back to the book. That was enough of a detour, I think. We asked ourselves this. Please highlight this. Are not some of us just as biased and unreasonable about the realm of the spirit as were the ancients about the realm of the material? Even in the present century, American newspapers were afraid to print an account of the Wright brothers' first successful flight at Kitty Hawk. Little tangent here. The date of that incident, the first flight at Kitty Hawk, when the Wright brothers actually achieved flight, was December 17, 1903. December 17th, 1903 was the first successful flight at Kitty Hawk. Hang with us here. Had not all efforts at flight failed before? Did not Professor Langley's flying machine go to the bottom of the Potomac River? Let's stop a second. Who is Professor Langley? Professor Langley is a physicist and an astronomer who was trying to learn about the laws that govern flight. He wasn't specifically learning to fly. This is a picture of good old Professor Langley. He wanted to just understand the laws of flight. How do birds stay up there? So he built a device and he tried to get across the Potomac River, and here's the result. That would be 51-2A, Andy. There's the end result of Professor Langley's flying machine, right into the Potomac. Didn't get too far, but he still was a scientist trying to prove about the laws of flight. Now let's continue in the book. Was it not true that the best mathematical minds had proved man could never fly? You may want to underline that. The best minds proved, and I've underlined proved, man couldn't fly. So scientists, mathematicians, all had knowledge and information on their side, and they said man could never fly. You know what the Wright brothers did for a living? They were bicycle mechanics. Simple bicycle mechanics. Their minds weren't fettered by mathematical laws and scientific laws. They just had a willingness and a belief they could do it. Their minds weren't fettered with superstition, tradition, fixed ideas. They didn't know that. They weren't that smart. They were bicycle mechanics who had a willingness and a belief to do something, and they succeeded. Despite the laws of science and mathematics, which proved it could never happen. Continuing, had not people said God had reserved this privilege to the birds? Only 30 years later, remember that number, 30 years later, the conquest of the air was almost an old story, and airplane travel was in full swing. You know what happened 30 years after this book was published? July 20th, 1969, man touched down on the moon. Just one of those coincidences that Bill picked 30 years to talk about this, and it gets even better. Watch what happens in the next paragraph. He said, but in most fields, our generation has witnessed, please highlight complete liberation of our thinking, freedom from old ideas, old emotions, old attitudes. Today, we don't have those same superstitions. Show any longshoreman a Sunday supplement describing a proposal to explore the moon by means of a rocket, and he'll say, I bet they do it. Maybe not so long either. 30 years. Is it odd or is it God? Is it just a coincidence that Bill picked that number 30 years and then picks this example for a longshoreman who's a guy who earns his living with his back? This is a guy who loads and unloads ships. He's a physical person, not a mental person, a physical person. And that guy said, I bet 30 years we get to the moon. 30 years later, we did. Those are the kind of coincidences that just make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Okay, let's continue. Is not our age characterized by the ease with which we discard old ideas for new? Please highlight the rest of this paragraph. Complete readiness with which we throw away the theory or gadget which does not work for something which does. And I'll go back to this, my iPhone. When the iPhones first came out, and the first phone was replaced by iPhone 2 a year later, I had to get that one. Was it that much difference? I don't know. I don't care. I had to get the new one. And I actually did that for about 10 cycles on this phone until I realized that the 10 was not any different from the 11 in substance. And I didn't have to trade in that gadget anymore. But I didn't think twice about doing it. That's what he's talking about here, with which we discard the old just to get the new. I'm going to suggest, please, that you highlight the entire next paragraph. And we're going to number the things in this paragraph. And then I'm going to suggest we forget about it for a little bit. The fact that we numbered them, that is. These are the bedevilments. Next to this paragraph on the left, that's what I've written, the bedevilments. These are also symptoms of a spiritual malady. These are traits of untreated alcoholism. These are indications of unmanageability. Does that give you enough titles for what we're about to read? Indications of unmanageability, traits of untreated alcoholism, symptoms of a spiritual malady. Now remember, on the top of the previous page, Bill said, put aside the drink question. We're setting that aside. We're not drinking anymore. What is life like without the bottle, but without a program? And that's what he's spelling out here. We had to ask ourselves, and we had to is a must. If I have to do something, it's a must. We had to ask ourselves why we shouldn't apply to our human problems the same readiness to change our point of view. Number one, we were having trouble with personal relationships. You having trouble with personal relationships when you came here? Or did all of that just take care of itself? See, I was one of those people who thought that all I had to do was stop drinking and drugging and everything would improve. Everything would get better. I still had trouble with personal relationships. Had other troubles too. Number two, we couldn't control our emotional natures. Number three, we were prey to misery and depression. Number four, we couldn't make a living. That doesn't mean we don't have a job. We're just not responsible. We can't seem to make ends meet when you're just using money to make yourself feel better, to buy the new things, the new gadget. If I only had this thing, everything would be okay. And since I'm not drinking now, I can afford to do that. And that thing doesn't solve my problem. And that only deepens my sense of pointlessness and futility. Number four, we couldn't make a living was number four. Number five, we had a feeling of uselessness. Number six, we were full of fear. Number seven, we were unhappy. Number eight, we couldn't seem to be of real help to other people. Now, very often when this paragraph is read, the reader stops here. And I think that's not getting the point, because he lays out these bedevilments, these 8 indications of unmanageability, to point out, look, this is what your life is like without the bottle, without the drugs, but without a program of recovery, without a suitable replacement. And then he poses a question. He lists all these things out. And this is the thing that I wish we would not leave out when we read this thing. Was not a basic solution of these bedevilments more important than blank? Fill in the blank with your distraction of choice. Bill's distraction of choice was watching newsreels of lunar flight. He dug that kind of shit. What do? Spend 3 hours a night on Facebook? Go to 4 Zoom meetings? What is it that you're doing in place of sitting down and working on your inventory? In place of meditating, in place of praying? What are you doing catching up on 8, 9 years of The Walking Dead? Sitting down and getting all the new things on Netflix? What is the distraction of your choice? There was a young lady in my home group back in Connecticut who used to always share at our weekly meetings that she's gonna sit down. This is gonna be the week. She's gonna sit down and do that 4th step. And the next week she said the same thing, and the next week she said the same thing. Now, this was a young lady who was a single parent, had 2 jobs, yet she admitted to spending 3 hours every night on Facebook. Now, Facebook will still be there when she finishes her inventory. She may not. And the truth of the matter is she did relapse several times. I hope she's doing okay now. I don't know. But the point is, there was a distraction, something to do in place of the work that needed to be done. Making a decision to do it is inadequate, insufficient if it's not immediately followed up with a plan of action, without taking action. God will not render us as white as driven snow without our participation. That's what it says in the 12 and 12. We must participate. Faith without works is dead. And as my friend Terry likes to say, works without faith is self-propulsion. But we're talking about the other way here, that faith without works is meaningless. So here's listing what life is like. Ask yourself, I shouldn't use my hands like that. It's bad. Is your life, does this describe your life? If you're in recovery and you identify with some of the things we just went through, you got some work to do, man. Got some work to do. And it's vital work. It's not squeezing it into your spare time. It's vital work. Because without it, without implementing this suitable alternative, this replacement, we will eventually realize that the pain that we're in sobriety is worse than the pain that we were in when we were drinking and drugging. So we convince ourselves that this time I could handle it. This time it'll be okay. I'll stop after 1. I'll stop after whatever lie we tell ourselves that justifies our taking that first drink or that drug. We do it because the pain of sobriety is unbearable. And then we drink until the pain of drinking is unbearable. And then we repeat that cycle over and over and over again. Well, the good news is the cycle ends right now, right here. If your life looks like one or more of these things, good news. There's a solution. Stick around. Okay. Was not a basic solution of these bedevilments more important than whether we should see newsreels of lunar flight? Of course it was. When we saw others solve their problems by a simple reliance upon the spirit of the universe, we had to stop. We had to. There's a must. If I had to do something, I must do something. But the point is here that seeing it work in others, going to meetings and seeing that other people have solved their problems by a simple reliance upon this power, you have to stop doubting the power of that God, whatever you want to call it, on your piece of paper, whatever that is, that power. And here's why. Please underline, our ideas did not work. Now, if you identify with one of the things we just read in those bedevilments, if you check off, if you tick off one or more of those things, please write down next to this or in the page opposite it, how is my way working? Not very good. If you check off some of those things, that way ain't working too well. Good news is we have a solution that will work. And here it is. Please highlight this in pink. It's a promise. But the God idea did. The Wright brothers' almost childish faith that they could build a machine which could fly was the mainspring of their accomplishment. Without that, nothing could have been accomplished. In the case of the Wright brothers, most people say that seeing is believing, right? You hear that expression all the time. In recovery, believing is seeing. To us, that's how we come to believe. We see it work in others. That's enough sufficient proof for me to put aside my old ideas, emotions, and attitudes, that obstinacy, that closed-mindedness, that prejudice. Continuing. Without that, nothing could have happened. We agnostics and atheists were sticking to the idea that self-sufficiency, underline self, would solve all problems, when others showed us that God's sufficiency, please underline that. I know it's half on one page and half on the other, but I'm sure you could figure out how to underline it. Showed us that God's sufficiency worked for them. We began to feel like those who insisted the Wright brothers would never fly. Oh, I know what I wanted to tell you. Going back to the beginning of that chapter, a childish faith. What is a childlike faith? What is that? Well, I'll give you an example. My son Ryan, who is now father to my incredibly gorgeous twin granddaughters. Ryan is now in his late 30s, but when he was about 4 or 5 years old, he was playing in front of the house and he took a spill. He went down and he slid across the pavement, tore up his arms, his belly, his knees. Somehow he kept his face up so it didn't tear up his face, but he was torn up and he was screaming like a stuck pig. I ran over and picked him up, and the second he put his head right here on my shoulder, he stopped crying. That's the childlike faith. See, he wasn't in pain so much as he was afraid. And now he was in the hands of his father, and he knew it was going to be okay. He didn't ask me, you got any pain meds, Dad? You got any bandages? You got a shot of something to kill this pain? He didn't do any of that. He was in my hands, and he knew going to be okay. That's the childish faith we're talking about. Seeing, knowing that works is what we're talking about. We have to have that childlike faith. All right, let's finish this one last paragraph. Logic is great stuff. Logic is defined as one's ability to think reasonably. That's logic. One's ability to think reasonably, to examine evidence, and draw conclusions. That's what logic is. It's an agnostic's higher power. We believe in our ability to reasonably solve any problem, to examine evidence, draw conclusions, figure it out. Logic is great stuff. We like it. We still like it. It's not by chance we're given the power to reason, to examine the evidence of our senses, to draw conclusions. Please underline reason. Please underline examine the evidence. Please underline draw conclusions. Because that's what we said logic is. The ability to reasonably, think reasonably, examine evidence, draw conclusions. We agnostically inclined would not feel satisfied with the proposal which does not lend itself to reasonable approach and interpretation. Hence, we're at pains to tell why we think our present faith is reasonable, why we think it more sane and logical to believe than not to believe, why we say our former thinking was soft and mushy when we threw up our hands in doubt and said, we don't know. We don't know. You have to stop trying to explain. We have to have a certain amount of faith because we see it in other people. Mark Houston said, we have to stop trying to figure out God. To find God, you must be out of your mind because you don't use that organ to find God. We find God with a different organ. We use a totally different organ.